Yep. Now, a little delayed an appearance through senior management responsibilities. My book, Before the Windrush, is in many ways a natural progression from my previous work on Liverpool's remarkable history and demographic mosaic. Hailed in its late Victorian heyday as, and this is my favourite quote, the New York of Europe, a world city rather than merely British provincial. Take that, Manchester, I always think. Liverpool, the human and commercial entrepot linking the old world and the new, was a vibrant, if not always harmonious, contact zone between different ethnic groups with different needs and intentions as transients, sojourners or settlers, categories which, of course, were by no means exclusive. There is no city in the world, not even London itself, Ramsay Muir recorded in the 700th anniversary history of the granting of letters patent to the borough in 1907, in which so many foreign governments find it necessary to maintain consular offices for the safeguarding of their exiled subjects. Well, at its Edwardian height, that 700th anniversary, polyglot, cosmopolitan Liverpool, the nation's proud second metropolis, stood proudly above the Coke Town monoculture of adjacent Lancastrian textile and industrial towns. In recent decades, however, as the history published to mark the 800th anniversary in 2007, which I had the honour to edit, acknowledged, the position has been dramatically reversed. Liverpool has become one of the least ethnically varied cities in the country, with only small numbers of new Commonwealth migrants arriving after 1945. The proportions of Hindus, Muslims and Sikhs falling significantly below the national average for England and Wales. The strapline of the successful European capital of culture bid, the world in one city, drew upon Liverpool's historical legacy rather than its contemporary complexion in 2008. Now, these changes in Liverpool's demographic mosaic obviously need to be understood within broad processes of imperialism, decolonisation, and economic decline. But the starting point for understanding the city's troubled history of race relations, however, is a specific contextual factor: legacies and memories of the slave trade. The deep shadow cast by this heinous trade continues, and its horrors and humanity should never be forgotten. However, the extent of any significant demographic continuity in the Liverpool black community back to the days of the slave trade is open to question. Although the apex of the infamous triangular trade across the Atlantic, Liverpool was not itself a major site for the sale of slaves, other than individuals sold by ship's captains as servants. Even so, by the late 18th century, Liverpool was the home of what Ray Costello describes as, I quote, a free black community drawn from many sources, including servants, students of noble descent sent for their education, along with the sons and daughters of African merchants and slavers, and dual heritage children, to use present-day terminology, of white plantation owners and African slave women. Numbers grew in Britain's oldest black community with the influx of discharged black soldiers. These were former slaves who had fought for the defeated British in the American War of Independence. However, Liverpool-born blacks of the 20th century seldom trace their ancestry back to that 18th century presence. Rather, they see themselves as the descendants of the considerable numbers of seamen, primarily West African, who dropped anchor and occasionally set sail from Liverpool a century later. Although not without problems, their presence in sailor town Liverpool, whether it was temporary or otherwise, was initially welcomed, attesting to the port's cosmopolitan image, an essential aspect of the civic rebranding as Victorian Liverpool, or Liverpolis as it liked to call itself, sought to distance itself not only from the mercenary Philistinism of the slaving past, but also from the narrow, woolly-back provincialism of its industrial hinterland. By the Edwardian period, however, the limitations of this new Liverpolitan cosmopolitanism were becoming apparent. Closely entwined with Edwardian notions of imperial mission, racial hierarchy, and national efficiency cosmopolitanism celebrated, I quote, the distinguishing attributes of the Anglo-Saxon race, with its wise and just rule over men of different races, religions, colour, customs and ideas. So, black and Asian people were seen as belonging out in the empire, not in Britain. Indeed, their physical presence within the port came to be seen as hindering Liverpool's efforts to attain national standards and minima and secure due primacy within the urban hierarchy, a major concern of Ramsay Muir when he was writing that 700th anniversary history in 1907. Let me quote. "This amazing polyglot and cosmopolitan population, consisting to a considerable extent of races which are backward in many ways, and maintaining itself largely by unskilled labour, vastly increases the difficulty of securing and maintaining the decencies of life." Now, the first to encounter this hardening of attitudes within this Edwardian cosmopolitanism were Lascars adrift, exploited sailors from the Indian subcontinent, forced to accept lower wages and harsher conditions by signing up to Asiatic articles. Their plight when in port was a major concern of the solicitor W.H. Quilliam, or better known as Sheikh ul-Islam of the British Isles, who offered welfare services at the Liverpool Islamic Institute in Broome Terrace, the English Mecca, which was itself often the target of attack by militant Baptists and local stone-throwing youths, rather inappropriately described as street Arabs. The harsh new attitudes quickly took hold. While still vaunting its credentials as a cosmopolitan city, to use Muir's running header in that 700th anniversary volume, Edwardian Liverpool supported the campaign for restrictive legislation, deported the alien Chinese, the Yellow Peril, and after the initially welcome expansion in numbers to serve the needs of the First World War, began to grapple with the intractable problem of, I quote, British coloureds from the colonies. And this was happening decades before the fabled arrival of the Empire Windrush at Tilbury in June 1948, which is conventionally regarded, again as I quote, year zero for black immigration. Regarding Britain as the mother country, the colonials who arrived in early 20th century Liverpool came through what they considered to be a process of internal migration within a common British world. But their legal status as British subjects notwithstanding, these coloured colonials in Liverpool were the first to discover there ain't no black in the Union Jack. Focused on Liverpool, where the colonial presence was far from new, my study then offers a prehistory, as it were, hence the book's title, of the deleterious race relations in Britain which accompanied and besmirched the otherwise vaunted transition from authoritarian empire to libertarian commonwealth. At the end of the First World War, the uneasy transition from war to peace had a disastrous impact on labour and race relations, amidst an economic reverse felt more acutely in Liverpool than elsewhere, a precursor of interwar depression and decline. Wartime xenophobic anti-alien fervour was transferred to the resident British coloured, purportedly taking jobs, and women, away from demobilised local white workers, denied the land fit for heroes promised by Lloyd George and the government. Race riots occurred in a number of ports across Britain in 1919, London, Glasgow, Hull, Cardiff, Barry, Salford. But those in Liverpool were particularly intense, reflecting tensions which extended far beyond the local waterfront. What happened in riotous Liverpool, the gateway of empire, reverberated across the globe. In fear of reprisals out in the colonies and the fracture of the imperial framework, the maintenance of which was considered vital to ensuring continued British dominance of transnational trade, culture and commerce, the Colonial Office stood forward after the 1919 riots to fund a generous repatriation scheme, seen as the best hope of safeguarding the good name of Britain and the integrity of the empire. Although lacking any formal remit or designated budget, the Colonial Office paid increasing attention to the treatment and welfare of coloured colonials domiciled in Britain, leading to the establishment of a specific welfare department, which soon established an office in Liverpool. During the Second World War, the local remit of that office was to extend beyond hospitality for temporary visitors, whether transient seamen, service personnel, or wartime workers, to consider the community needs of the long-established but previously neglected resident coloured population. Such liberalism in a surprisingly unlikely quarter, the Colonial Office, ran counter to repeated attempts by an unholy alliance of cost-cutting shipping owners, notably Elder Dempster Line, racist trade union leaders, defenders of the wages of whiteness, and hard-pressed local officials concerned about public order to redefine, or rather, let's be honest, restrict the notion of British nationality. A persistent presence, racism took different forms at different times in Liverpool, reflecting the ambiguities, the inconsistencies, and the contradictions on which it was constructed. Let me quote from the Home Office. "We have done what we can to prevent the alien element increasing, but there is no power to deal with the British element," the Home Office replied to criticism of the growing black presence in interwar Liverpool. "It is a penalty of being a mother country with a large mixed empire. The most that we can do is to discourage coloured seamen from obtaining British passports so that we can treat them as aliens when they get here and prevent them remaining." Incredible. Such racism also prevailed in philanthropic endeavour, a potent blend of paternalism, missionary zeal, and faddist eugenics. Muriel Fletcher's infamous report on an investigation into the colour problem in Liverpool for the Liverpool Association for the Welfare of Half-Caste Children drew upon the new binary orthodoxy, contrasting the virtue of the now rehabilitated Chinese with the vice and real social menace of the Negro. Underneath the pseudo-scientific and biological racism, the report differed little from the blend of sex, prejudice and economics favoured by other advocates of repatriation and restriction. In his laudatory foreword to the report, Professor Roxby questioned the value of any temporary expedient short of, I quote, "the total exclusion of Negro labour on ships entering the port." For all its shortcomings, the report had deleterious contemporary and enduring impact, serving to cement, as Mark Christensen has observed, the derogatory term half-caste into the social perception of the city, along with previously held stereotypes about black families, and gave them credence via seemingly objective and unbiased analysis. According to Harold King, the warden of the university settlement and the secretary of the Liverpool Association for the Welfare of Half-Caste Children, being half-caste was, in his words, in the modern industrial world, a handicap comparable to physical deformity. Visitors to the city, however, took a more kindly view, delighting in the cosmopolitan complexion of the south end of the city, where J.B. Priestley encountered a primary school resembling, I quote, "a miniature League of Nations assembly gone mad. All the races of mankind were there, wonderfully mixed. Looking at them, you did not think of the riff-raff of the Stokeholds and the Slattums of the slums who had served as their parents. They seemed like the charming exotic fruits, which indeed they were, of some profound anthropological experiment." Within the black community itself, there were self-help agencies to help contest this racism, most notably the African Church's Mission, run by Pastor Daniel Zekati. Liverpool's coloured centre, the Mission in Hill Street, ministered, I quote, "to the body as well as the soul. There is a social centre for recreation and a canteen where destitute Africans are temporarily fed and sheltered as far as our limited funds permit." While seeking British justice free of prejudice for colonials born or domiciled in Liverpool, Ekati actually favoured their return to Africa once suitably trained and skilled. By the late 1930s, industrial training for those pejoratively labelled as half-caste was the chief aim of the mission, in preparation for their return to Africa to promote colonial development and independence. It was this scheme which brought Ekate to the approval and attention of Harold Moody's League of Coloured Peoples, the authentic voice of the small middle-class black elite in Britain, whose attention was promptly diverted from Cardiff, where there had been racial conflict in 1935, to concentrate all its efforts on Liverpool. During the Second World War, both the League of Coloured Peoples and the recently formed Colonial Office Welfare Department established a presence in Liverpool, initially to attend to the needs of West Indian technicians and trainees brought across from the Caribbean on a labour recruitment scheme. On their arrival, the Colonial Office, who'd been very worried about recent disturbances out in the West Indies, had sought to make, and I quote, this is an incredible quotation, such arrangements for the social life of these Jamaicans as would prevent their becoming contaminated by the rather unsatisfactory West African seaman population of Liverpool. In mobilising the colonies for global war, Britain was obliged to redefine the imperial mission to move forward, much to the approval of the League of Coloured Peoples, from tutelage to partnership and thence onwards to colonial self-government. If this process is not to be frustrated, it is of the first importance that those who come to this country from the colonial empire shall feel that here too, partnership is a fact and not a phrase, the Times commented, noting with concern that, quote, racial discrimination is not always easy to avoid. The application of the local colour bar in Liverpool, accentuated by this segregation applied by US troops, of course it wouldn't mix with the coloured American Labour Corps who were also brought over, came under critical scrutiny, particularly as directed against, and here again I quote, those notoriously touchy West Indians. It soon became apparent that discrimination-free wartime accommodation, hospitality and recreation for the new coloured arrivals could not be provided in discreet, self-contained manner. Account had also to be taken of the needs of long-term black residents previously ignored and or traduced. Planning for post-war reconstruction included innovative community proposals to tackle segregation and discrimination for the benefit of the resident black population. Unable to assume domestic responsibility beyond the service of first resort offered by its Liverpool office, the Colonial Office Welfare Department struggled to persuade the relevant authorities and agencies to put aside objections to special provision and commit resources to initiatives such as a proposed Stanley House Community Centre. Progress with that intended flagship project was tortuously slow, as the local authority refused to infringe its colourblind impartiality, a stance, of course, which it retained up to and beyond the 1981 riots, while well-meaning voluntary agencies worried lest any special provision might prove counterproductive, reinforcing the failing of segregation. Well, projects like Stanley House suggested that black Liverpudlians should be included within the post-war construction of Britishness. But there was no desire for any increase in the numbers of dark strangers in our midst. A reaffirmation of pre-war definitions of imperial citizenship, the British Nationality Act of 1948 maintained an open door for all British subjects from the Empire and Commonwealth. But there was a marked preference for post-war labour market needs to be met instead by alien workers from Eastern Europe, recruited on the basis of their, I quote, presumed genetic similarity. In a reprise of events after the First World War, the Home Office ensured the swift and comprehensive deportation of the alien Chinese, while the Colonial Office encouraged the repatriation of coloured colonials, not only the undesirable and unemployable, but also the upwardly mobile, those expected to remain grateful for the skills, training and professional qualifications acquired during their wartime sojourn. Well, once again, the transition to peace hit Liverpool hard with a return to high levels of unemployment, while labour shortage applied elsewhere, soon followed by a further round of race riots over the August bank holiday weekend in 1948. Liverpool, as fieldwork undertaken by an American academic confirmed, was the major problem community in what was now called race relations. This distressing context notwithstanding, the number of new arrivals from the colonies, whether passengers or stowaways, increased significantly, well ahead of the arrival of the Empire Windrush at Tilbury in June 1948. They came over in a mistaken belief of continued wartime high wage rates. Although encouraged to move on from depressed Liverpool, there were fears that being ill-suited to labour market needs and life in industrial areas, they would drift back to be with their own kind, living off generous benefits and compounding the special social problems which result from their presence. Liverpool remained at the forefront of concern about race relations into the 1950s, as new forms of black organisation emerged, more militant than either the middle-class League of Coloured Peoples or Ecarte's religious spiritual mission. The removal of 25% of colonial seamen from the shipping register prompted a vehement response amongst the resident black community, spearheaded by the communist-influenced Colonial People's Defence Association. The Communist Party, indeed, was to accord special attention to Liverpool in the early 1950s, the key city in the joint struggle for colonial rights at home and abroad. Having been the focus of concern in the troubled post-war years into the early 1950s, Liverpool underwent a remarkable transition thereafter, emerging as a model of race relations, aided by a period of relative, alas all too short-lived, prosperity through belated industrial diversification. The various favourable developments of the late 1950s, early 1960s, however, were by no means unproblematic. A seeming testament to multicultural Liverpool, the remarkable flourishing of ethnic associational culture in these years, from the tribal to the pan-national, revealed the complexity and the heterogeneity of the coloured community. But the highly segmented structure precluded a united black front against discrimination. On the other side, though, coordination was very much to the fore in the newly established all-white Colonial Welfare Committee, a multi-agency initiative led by the Personal Service Society, which stepped forward when the Colonial Office had to close its Liverpool Welfare Office. While galvanising the local voluntary sector to redress the disadvantage endured by the black community, it stopped well short of any provision which might encourage an increase in its numbers. Still lauded as a flagship project, Stanley House Community Centre was often beset with conflict over its paternalistic management style and its inability to satisfy the competing needs of new arrivals, ethnic groups and Liverpool-born blacks. Furthermore, the branch plant prosperity of the affluent 1950s and early 1960s, the formative period of Merseybeat, was not immediately accessible to the black community. Close to outer council estates, much favoured by the rehoused white working class but eschewed by blacks, the new industrial plants were far away from the security of the Granby Triangle, with its networks of ethnic community mutuality, its shebeens, its clubs, and its other compensationary delights, popular attractions which Stanley House could not match. But even though I've entered some of those qualifications, Liverpool was nevertheless regarded as a success story in community relations in the late 1950s, confirmed by its avoidance of the race riots of 1958, which hit Notting Hill and Nottingham and so on, after which Liverpool was regularly approached for advice by other cities now experiencing the post-Windrush influx. How did you manage to avoid the riots? The good times did not endure. As economic prospects declined, community relations deteriorated, although journalists, politicians and officials persisted in regarding Liverpool as exemplary. Critical dissent was expressed first by those concerned with local black youth, as in the report with a very significant title, Special but Not Separate, produced by the Liverpool Youth Organisations Committee, an ominous examination of the situation of young coloured people in Liverpool. Obscured by the national preoccupation with immigration and new arrivals, the discrimination and disadvantage experienced by Liverpool-born black youths lay concealed and festering beneath the spurious local rhetoric of harmonious relations. Evidence presented to the Select Committee on Race Relations shortly afterwards suggested that Liverpool, so far from being a role model, stood as ominous object lesson, foreshadowing problems to come if British-born children of recent arrivals were to encounter the same levels of discrimination and disadvantage that Liverpool-born bracks had been enduring for decades. Then came the riots of 1972, an early warning from Liverpool, mainly unheeded, of trouble ahead as the British-born children of the Empire Windrush generation approached adolescence, alienation, and racial polarisation. Well, why was so little attention accorded to these prescient lessons and warnings from Liverpool? Obsessed with immigration and new arrivals, the race relations industry, which developed in the wake of legislation in the late 1960s, tended to overlook Liverpool. Newly arrived immigrants from the West Indies, India and Pakistan constituted a mere 0.4% of the local population in Liverpool, well below the threshold for resource investment and concern. Shunned by new Commonwealth migrants, recession-blighted Liverpool was soon in free fall down the urban hierarchy, a seemingly unstoppable descent from having been the proud second city of empire into the shock city of post-industrial, post-colonial Britain. So far from serving as warning and object lesson in race relations, Liverpool was cast in another role, designated and denigrated as a proverbial and irredeemable exception, an internal other at odds with positive developments elsewhere in enterprise Britain. For agencies seeking to regenerate and rehabilitate the city, measures to address racial discrimination and disadvantage were seldom a priority or even mentioned in a succession of ill-fated projects to tackle multiple deprivation. Local councillors continued to subscribe to the fiction of racial harmony, dismissing all who argued otherwise as, I quote, interfering do-gooders and sensationalist sociologists. In the continued absence of any acknowledgement of the special but not separate needs of the black British population in the city, the Liverpool City Council simply sought to emulate developments elsewhere, implementing English language centres and other forms of reception provision for new arrivals. Of no relevance, of little relevance, to the long-established and long-suffering black Liverpudlians, such projects caused anger and offence, hindering the efforts of those seeking to promote community relations. New levels of police harassment of black youths exacerbated the tension, leading to the formation of the Merseyside Anti-Racialist Alliance, I quote, to combat the institutionalized forms of racial discrimination that have existed on Merseyside for a very long time. Working with this umbrella organisation, a panoply of local black groups, supported by the under-resourced Merseyside Community Relations Council and attendant academics in the Merseyside Area Profile Group, campaigned hard to force the City Council to fulfil its legal obligations and implement a long overdue equal opportunities policy. Having finally exceeded, what did the local authority do? It immediately reduced the funding to the Community Relations Council and to the various voluntary agencies working in the field. Shortly afterwards, within a month of the outbreak of rioting on Liverpool 8 in 1981, the Select Committee on Race Relations, having heeded the warning signs, issued an ominous report acknowledging that Liverpool was, I quote, the most disturbing case of racial disadvantage in the United Kingdom, a grim warning to all of Britain's cities that racial disadvantage cannot be expected to disappear by natural causes. Well, let's move on a month to those riots. Downplaying the role of race, left-wing activists claimed the events of summer 1981 as, I quote, a revolt of the unemployed, a riot of the dispossessed. However, the specific location of the riots within a distinct part of Liverpool 8, misreported by the media as Toxteth, indicated a crucial racial component. Originating in Granby, these were not race riots in the pattern of 1919, 1948 and 1972. But nevertheless, racial factors served as proximate and defining cause, as Philip Waller, I think, has made clear in his analysis. Let me quote Philip. The rioting was not a race riot in that the struggle was not white against black or vice versa, but there was a strong racial component to it, in that rioting would probably never have occurred without the lead being taken by the blacks who were aggrieved at police practices. Unavailing attempts to keep the post-rioting post-mortem focused on that central issue of police harassment came to symbolise the black struggle for recognition of their special but not separate needs. Brushing aside the ill-conceived racism of the chief constable and his force, official response to the 1981 riots took the form of headline-grabbing initiatives to tackle urban deprivation, not institutional racism. Of dubious benefit to the black community, Michael Heseltine's vaunted regeneration schemes came at the expense of central government financial support for local government, lessening the funds available for the mainstream services actually utilised by Liverpool blacks. Progress on the equal opportunities policy came to a halt when Militant took control of the city council shortly afterwards, with a workerist ideology of absolute class solidarity which prohibited, with even more rigour than the old colourblind policy, any form of divisive positive action to tackle racial discrimination and disadvantage. In a gesture of goodwill and reconciliation, the new Labour administration, which replaced Militant in 1987, called upon Lord Gifford, who had recently chaired the Broadwater Farm Inquiry, to examine race relations in the city. Drawing upon their long experience in London, Leeds, Bradford and Manchester, the inquiry team judged racism in Liverpool to be uniquely horrific. Overlooked through the post-war decades by the obsession with immigration and the number of new arrivals, Liverpool-born blacks were out of place in the subsequent embrace of multiculturalism. Heralded at the time, but now questioned, multiculturalism, as employed in the UK, offered immigrant groups protection, collective mutuality and token recognition, but within rigid segmented ethnic fiefdoms which tended to fix, naturalise and essentialise cultures. There was no place here for the hybrid and creative needs of a truly multicultural society. Ethnic minorities remained circumscribed, unwilling to look beyond particularist boundaries for fear of jeopardising their claim to grants resources as a distinct group. Being several generations British, although not always recognised as such, black Liverpudlians lacked an immigrant point of ethno-cultural access to get into this form of multiculturalism, while still remaining marginalised, ignored or repudiated by the dominant host culture. Given the history of Liverpool 8, terms such as mixed race carried similar offence to the despised categorisation half-caste. When community relations came under critical scrutiny, academic researchers suggested the appellation Afro-English. I mean, we hear a lot about Afro-Americans, but never Afro-English. But this failed to gain purchase. I think there's a very telling contrast here with the Liverpool Irish, who, having endured disadvantage and discrimination, were able to enter the white mainstream and secure a hyphenated identity. Indeed, the Liverpool Irish slummy, emblematic of the Liverpudlian struggle against adversity, misperception and misrepresentation, came to be regarded as the prototypical Scouser. Not your black Scousers, though. Ethnographic studies, this is my last point, conducted by Jacqueline Nussey-Brown in the early 1990s, suggested that the only way Liverpool blacks could cope with all of this, well, there were two ways. They either sought to establish their own racial identity or else sought solace in some form of pan-racial nostalgia. In the first approach, a polarising process of localisation as racialisation, the collective place-birth lineage embodied in the signifier Liverpool-born black was accorded exclusionary force. If you weren't born in Liverpool, you weren't black. Not always welcoming to new arrivals from the Caribbean and the post-colonial Africa or recent refugees from Somalia, this local essentialism gave a black and alternative inflection to Mersey pride, the insistence on exceptionalism and apartness through which the city mediated its descent into marginality. The alternative to that form of local blackness was to evoke the Liverpool that was, a reified, authentic, multicultural Liverpool belonging to all. In this imagined past, before history and geography turned against Liverpool, the community mentality of the Scotty Road slummy coexisted with a broader culture, a seafaring cosmopolitanism celebrated in black popular memory, in genealogical research, and in the multimedia outputs of mapping memory projects. In her autobiography, Bessie Braddock, local councillor, then MP for Liverpool Exchange, sort of reflects this nostalgic things. She calculated that some 75,000 patients, as she called them, from around the globe have visited her constituency surgery since the 1930s. I quote, "They included Chinese, Africans, Indians, Pakistanis, Jamaicans, Adenese, Arabs, every race and colour you can think of. Strictly speaking, I'm there for the benefit of my constituents, who are a cosmopolitan crowd, but in practice, I am at the service of people from all over the world." Well, as reconstructed in popular memory, the diaspora space of Sailor Town, Liverpool, is revered as being at the service from people all over the world. Exotic, multicultural space. But no more than a memory, cosmopolitanism evaporated as this Sailor Town itself disappeared through urban redevelopment, wartime bomb damage, and distant relocation of the working docks. The more problematic meanings associated with the area were to remain, however, accompanying the black community in the short move away from the waterfront into the Granby Triangle. This circumscribed area on the maritime urban frontier, Sailor Town, with its pubs, its brothels, its secondary economy of the streets, has really sort of stood as metonym for the whole city. It's the critical influence in the representations of Liverpool's distinctive culture, character, and history. An exception within Britain, with this Sailor Town culture, Liverpool was perhaps representative, perhaps formatively so, of developments in other major seaports across the globe. Go to any other major seaport and I guarantee you'll find a pub or a bar with Liverpool in their names, servicing the needs of transcultural, transnational maritime labour. Black communities in the near waterfront zone of European seaport cities have inherited many of the defining myths of Sailor Town in terms of crime, vice and foreignness, and have found it difficult to disabuse such misperception and media misrepresentation. If I've achieved anything in Before the Windrush, I hope it's at least that for Liverpool, I've started the much needed process of historical reappraisal. Thank you. 40 minutes on the clock.
Excellent. Thank you very much, John. Jam-packed. I'm sure there's lots of questions. Who would like to begin? Daniel?
Yeah. Two short questions, if I may. One is it true that in 1981 a squash club was burnt down because it was still operating a colour bar? And two, was part of militants' extreme negativity about anything to do with race, the issue that multiculturalism was seen as a kind of an ideology that came from London, from a kind of rainbow alliance of blacks and white lefties in a London that was therefore to be rejected because of the kind of Liverpool London antagonism.
Right. Okay. Let's take the first one. In fact, it was a very highfalutin thing. It wasn't squash, it was rackets. It was the Rackets Club, as it was known. And I think the bar there would probably be as much socio-economic as it was to do with any phenotypical difference of skin colour and so on. I certainly don't think I'd have been allowed in the Rackets Club, for example. And very interestingly, of course, the Rackets Club was adjacent to a hospital. The Rackets Club is totally destroyed. No damage at all is done to the hospital next door. So it's one example of that sort of disciplined, targeted nature of violence, isn't it? Second question about militants is more controversial and difficult because militants sop to this is to appoint a race relations advisor, the infamous Sam Bond. And the infamous Sam Bond is not a citizen of Liverpool 8, but actually is brought up from London. Because he's seen as being very much within the pay of militants and ideologically sound. So knew nothing at all, had no experience in any form of social work, in any form of community relations and so on. But it was just one of the lads that was in militant. but I mean, objected to on the grounds of complete lack of experience with this thing, but also the fact that he was, an outsider. Although, I can speak for the fact that Londoners can survive in Liverpool. I've managed it for. Yeah.
Given the current sort of Islamophobia that's prevalent in Britain today, is there a reflection of the cocoonness, the sort of protection around, the protective thinking around Liverpool's communities that happens over there in Bradford or in London, and it doesn't happen here in Liverpool? Is there a similar sort of reflection of what happened in the past currently happening in the city?
Yeah, I mean, well, I immediately enter the caveat as a historian. Don't listen to anything I say about the present, because it won't be with any level of expertise. But it's very interesting, isn't it? That I've been trying to argue that there has long been a inverted commas coloured presence in Liverpool for decades before anywhere else. But yet you could live in parts of Liverpool and be completely oblivious of this. And the fact that it's always said is that even to this day, there is hardly a black face to be seen in city centre Liverpool. They were very much within that Sailor Town area at first, and then moved slightly up the hill into the Granby Triangle. The very interesting thing now about the Granby Triangle is that the days that I'm writing about it it's full of West Indians, West Africans, so probably with West Indians and so on. It's changed completely. That this is now the area which, just as those people had stayed within the area, the West Africans and the black had stayed there for security. I mean, it's called the Harlem of Liverpool, and they don't move out of it, and that's why they don't take advantage, as I was saying, of those jobs in the factories out in Speke or Aintree or whatever, because that's too far away from them. They want to stay within that security. That area, as I see it now, Gramshire, living just on the fringes of it, has changed completely, in the sense that the African presence that I used to recognise there has been replaced by something which you wouldn't immediately describe as African. You would now describe it as Islamic, with the first epithet you would use to describe what you're seeing there now. So they've gone there presumably for the same protection. What has happened, I mean, I would like to think that, although, I mean, I'm slightly worried about any group feeling the need to have to defensively segregate itself. I mean, I would not ever advocate that. But there is a positive in this, in the sense that the previous occupants of that have been able to move, presumably, or where have they gone? They presumably must have actually now merged into other parts of the city, which is great if that's happened. Let's hope that might then, in turn, in a few decades, help them to the current Islamic segregation. That will disperse. It should be a much healthier demographic for the city.
A couple of small questions, I think. The Chinese community in Liverpool, how have they fared? You kind of outlined a series of riots, and obviously they're quite geographically distinctly located. Now they have this kind of, they're often promoted as part of the tourist attractions in Liverpool. How did they fare?
Well, the Chinese one is very interesting, in the sense that, I mean, though I wanted to make sure I got my Lascaux, so I did get some sort of Islamic thing straight away in. I mean, the ones who really feel it is the Yellow Peril before the First World War. That's when you really see it, and they're accused of doing all sorts of terrible things and so on. But when they have this investigation, it finds out that they're not that immoral, they're not that drunk, and they do like to gamble, that's true, and so on. But any such crime is committed within their own community. They also turn out to be like model citizens. And when you move the clock on a bit, and then you've got all these problems of West African seamen and other coloured colonials who've come over to fight in the First World War and stay, you then get a change. And the most interesting change I've noticed, actually, is amongst the Catholic priesthood. Because they'd originally been very opposed to Irish girls coming across and marrying into the Chinese. But they then decide, actually, this is probably the best thing that they can do. Because unlike, I'm quoting them, not me, unlike the West Africans and West Indians, they don't get hit by their husbands if they have the Chinese things and so on. They don't suffer any of that. And in fact, it's even argued that although the Chinese want these wives as their sex slaves, the price prepaid, they will do all the housework, they'll do everything for them and so on. So they're absolutely, the sort of almost model new men from this thing. So the Chinese become fantastically accepted. So that's the interwar thing, and that's why Muriel Fletcher is comparing, these rehabilitated Chinese, now seen as model things. They don't drink, they don't do things like that. Right. and don't commit domestic violence, they're fine, and so on, and they want their kids educated, all the things, contrasting all of that with England. But then the Second World War comes along, and you're using all these, very important to have all these senior things, but after the Second World War, you decide you want to get rid of them. Well, there is the memorial on the waterfront to what happens there, because these people are considered to be alien. They don't actually have British protected citizen status or British subject status and so on. So you can get rid of them, even if they are married to British women. And this, of course, is terrible, terrible problem. So, I mean, there are still to this day people in the Liverpool Chinese community who are brought up by single mothers, although they, you know, where is their father? Their father was deported back, they've never been able to find them. It's a terrible thing. And this is all put down to all sorts of supposedly gambling and black market activity, which is happening at the end of the Second World War. Plus, I think it's a reminder as well that the Second World War, as I'm saying, you know, it requires us to use our full empire, which is why we have to change from sort of empire to Commonwealth. We have to change our attitudes to these things. It goes on after, you know, VE Day. There's still an awful lot to do, and it becomes sailors from China are going to be very, very important if you're going to actually end the war up in Asia itself. So the fact that these blokes are spending their times in gambling dens and playing the black market and not really turning up to go to sea, that really does cause offence in some quarters, which is why you get this very, very harsh thing and you get them all being sent out. But then, you know, you follow the story through, and yes, it's all part of, you know, Liverpool's new, Liverpool's renaissance and then things that, you know, you have a World Heritage Site, you can become capital of culture. You also have to have the largest Chinese arch outside things, you know, and it looks you have a Chinatown, the oldest Chinatown in Europe, a must-do thing, and you hop on, hop off bus going around Liverpool and so on. But total, well, ridiculous in the sense that Shanghai sailor community, which was the oldest Chinese thing, that's all gone. And what you're getting now is people, how can I put this, you know, people who have decided to come from Hong Kong, you know, are Cantonese, completely different, don't speak the same language or anything of that nature, and have all sorts of different activities and are spread right throughout the city. You know, they're not clustered in Chinatown. You've just got the old decaying remnants of the Shanghai sailors there. So there's all sorts of fascinating things if you look at the Chinese.
I just add, this is unfair, but the Polish community that
Yes.
has developed in Liverpool over the last 30 years, where are they based? What's their position in this? Because often, you know, I know a little bit about Luton, and I know the Polish community that's come there has actually gone to the sort of British Asian kind of area, so they're moving out, and there's those kind of tensions there. What's happening with them?
I don't know how many people here are up on the nightlife scene in Liverpool, but I think, you know, the most significant and symbolic thing of that the oldest Catholic church in the city centre, St Peter's in Seal Street, managed to keep a congregation simply because it became the Polish Church of Liverpool. And this is well before this is before sort of Nigel Farage has even thought about polls and so on. So these are, you know, if you like, people who'd been part of the war effort and had stayed and so on. So this is not free movement of EU Labour. We're talking about, and they'd kept that going. But what has happened to St Peter's Seal Street? It's now Alma de Cuba, and it's one of the, you know, the great hotspots of Liverpool. And, you know, you can drink your cocktails on the altar, and it's really quite something. I think that's very, very symbolic of what's gone on. So there was a small element of there. I mean, I hope, you know, the ironies in all this are quite remarkable in the sense that the free movement of labour, which we now see as a European thing, was of course originally defined as being British. I mean, that's the great thing. It doesn't matter wherever you were in that empire in which the sun never set. If you lived in that, you had free movement of labour, and that was an absolutely cardinal principle. So, you know, I often want to, you know, if I was ever talking to Farage, which I doubt I shall ever do, I'd say, right, okay, if you want to revert to that, if you want to revert to be on Britain things, presumably that means that all these things, including people who might have, you know, different skin colour, you know, free movement of labour is absolutely cardinal principle, being British. And yet, ironically, you know, just after the Second World War, you don't want those people. You want to get rid of all of those, and you bring in Poles and so on because they come in as alien, and being alien, the minute you don't want them, you've got no problem at all kicking them out. Incredible.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Professor Belchem, for a fantastic opening for our journey this semester, and I think it's great that we'll end up going to Munich of 1972 in our next session, and the Olympics massacre there, and how Europe has dealt with this. We'll be moving on to Haiti in the 19th century and to France and the UK in contemporary EU elections. But I think it's great that we've been able to begin here with Liverpool. So thank you very much indeed. Thank you.